Are we facing a new Cold War? Many people seem to think so. However, others believe that we cannot equate the present level of rivalry among the great world powers of today to the 60s or 70s. During the time of the Cold War, the world was split in two. You were either an ally of the US and its capitalist system, or an ally of the Soviet Union and its socialism. In the year 1980, the US was the #1 economy in the world with $2.8 trillion, and the second was the Soviet Union. The two strongest in the world had two different governing philosophies, but the economic and military power that they both possessed was uncontested. However, the Soviet Union and all its satellite states would see its end by the late 80s. When this collapse occurred, it left the United States as the sole superpower in the world. For the United States, this vacuum of a counterpower allowed it to expand its economic and political influence like never before. The world would then become a unipolar world, at least during the time that Russia was recovering. When the USSR dissolved, it was the third largest economy in the world, just after Japan. It would be more than 20 years later that Russia would reappear among the top 10 world economies in 10th place. Although Spain currently has almost a bigger economy than Russia, Russia is present in all international political conflicts. Russia is no longer the only power that is in a way opposing the United States. They now have a great ally, China. It is the only country in the world that can potentially dethrone the US economically and politically. Another potential ally is also emerging, India, which had recently surpassed France in GDP and may become another headache for DC. Today we will see how these three giants, India, Russia, and China, coexist in the multipolar world, and if these countries are effectively allies that will form a possible new alliance countering NATO. Well, an organization of that type already exists. It is called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So without further introduction, let's begin. It was December 1991. The former Soviet Union was still recovering from their dissipation. They faced decades of economic stagnation, revolts in the satellite countries, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the failed reforms of Gorbachev led to the end of the USSR. Former Soviet President Gorbachev wanted to reform the Soviet system. He wanted to liberalize it from state power without necessarily implying a change of political regime. An existing similar approach is modern-day China, which has an authoritarian and communist regime, but at the same time has a free market economy to a certain extent. However, for the Soviets, this didn't pan out too well. Moscow failed in their reforms, and the Soviet Union was broken up into 13 smaller pieces. It would take Russia several decades to recover and regain a place in the world's top economies. In 1993, Russia and China had exactly the same GDP, around $440 billion, and both were considered to be third world countries. By the year 2002, the Western powers recognized the Russian effort and the increase of Russian influence, and they were incorporated into the G8, a group of the 8 most industrialized countries in the world. For Russia, it had barely been 10 years since the demise of the Soviet Empire, but it still had a lower GDP than when the Soviet Empire first fell. Today, China has a GDP that is 10 times larger than that of Russia, but China has 1.4 billion citizens while Russia only has 130 million. So, China also has a population that is 10 times larger than Russia, and this explains why Russia has a GDP per capita of $10,000, while China's GDP per capita is only at $8,000. Even so, the economic growth of the Asian giant cannot go unnoticed. Let's take a look at this historical GDP graph. Here we can see the gross domestic product of both China and Russia. We can see that for a long time, Russia and China were practically the same, but nothing happened. Effectively, China became industrialized and quickly developed into a massive geopolitical power. If we added India into this graph, we can see that both China and India have economically ousted Russia a long time ago. And although Kremlin does not like to admit it, the new economic powers that will rival the US and Europe will not be Moscow, but it will instead be Beijing and New Delhi. In recent years, the rise of China has been unprecedented. In the educational aspect, their universities are increasingly conducting more research. Now, Chinese universities threaten the hegemony of the British and American universities. Millions of Chinese students study and work abroad, and at the same time, millions of international students are coming to China. Technological brands of smartphones and computers are invading the Western world, financing their public and private banks, earning trillions of dollars for the country. In fact, China will eventually become the #1 world power in economics, diplomacy, and military by 2050, replacing the United States. So why are Vladimir Putin and Russia still so present in the international scene? Well, we mustn't forget that Russia still has a very, very powerful military, and they are rich in natural resources such as gas and oil. With more than 7,000 nuclear bombs and the second most powerful army in the world, it doesn't matter if your economy is shattered if you want to make an impact on the world. Russia and the US are practically involved in every single international political conflict. For example, Venezuela, Syria, Ukraine, Cuba, Turkey, the list goes on. Even if the Russian economy is smaller than the entire state of New York, Vladimir Putin is always present when it comes to geopolitics, not only due to their atomic weapons, but also in real practice. He is one of the most powerful men in the world because he always stands his ground in international issues. For example, the Russian intervention in Syria, the annexation of Crimea, its control of a large part of Europe's gas supply, as well as Russia's financing of Venezuela, and the increasingly close relationship that they have with Turkey. So in practice, Russia is the geopolitical counterpower of the US. The United States has even accused Russia of trying to revive its old habits and attitudes that the Soviet Union carried out during the Cold War. What must be understood is that Russia, as a world power, has its sphere of regional influence and sees it crucial to maintain its influence in this area. Just as China has its area of regional influence, and the United States, well, they're absolutely everywhere. China is heavily focused on developing its economic power, and we could say that Russia concentrates on building and maintaining its military power. Both countries view the US as their rival. China is a rising power, but both the US and China need each other. But its continued economic and diplomatic expansion seems to make the US anxious that it will lose its place as the #1 world power. The United States must make way for China to expand. Trying to repress or contain its influence could lead to even greater tensions, such as the current trade war or DC's intention to limit the use of Chinese technology. In the case of India, this country is undergoing a similar process but not identical to that experienced by China. The rapid demographic and industrial growth of this country has made New Delhi more present in the geopolitical context. India is the largest democracy in the world, and we could say that it is the most democratic country out of the three giants of Asia. The United States can no longer ignore these powers that may quickly overtake them in the near future. So at the beginning of 2001, Moscow and Beijing founded the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, also known as the SCO. It is an organization that promotes the effort to launch and strengthen relations in the Asian continent and undertake a process of integration and economic, political, and even military cooperation. The SCO currently has 8 full members: China, Russia, India, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Pakistan. Observer members include Afghanistan, Iran, and Mongolia. In itself, the SCO would have irrefutable economic and military power. These 8 countries would confer the #1 economy and army in the world. They would have more than 10 million soldiers, including 4 atomically armed countries: India, China, Russia, and Pakistan. Since its creation, the SCO has conducted military training exercises. The last one was held last year between China and Russia in Siberia, where more than 200,000 Russian soldiers and 3 million Chinese soldiers participated. This is one of the largest military exercises ever conducted. And even if China, Russia, and India seem to be allies facing the US, it is one thing for them to share a common opponent, but it is another to share economic, political, and strategic interests. China increasingly gains international political strength, especially in matters that concern its area of influence, such as North Korea and the China Sea. Anyway, China and Russia are both countries with permanent seats on the UN Security Council, and in most resolutions of Western interest, China and Russia have always utilized their vetoes. Examples of this include the resolution to condemn Venezuela or resolutions condemning Syria. So is India also a state that the US needs to worry about right now? The truth is, in the past, given the complicated relations between Pakistan and India, involving bloody wars and conflicts, the US has never taken one side. But they did sell arms and logistical support to Pakistanis, actions New Delhi would consider as taking a side. But that is in the past. In the present, there are quite a few trade agreements between New Delhi and DC. In fact, India is much more of an ally than an enemy for the United States, a country with which it never had any conflicts. On the other hand, its neighboring country China has already had more than 4 wars and maintains disputed Kashmir areas in the north. Even so, these acts have also passed, and India has since developed great commercial alliances with the US, and in the past, they have carried out multiple military exercises together. India also happens to be the 9th largest trading partner of the US. Even so, India is very cautious with the US's actions. In the year 2016, they refused to participate in the South China Sea confrontation against China, citing political reasons. Clearly, they didn't intend to go against China. And in the year 2017, India joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a full member. There have been many comments stating that the SCO will end up as the counter NATO and that it will be a new geo-economic and military power in the world. However, the SCO cannot be directly compared to NATO, which represents the main collective military alliance of the United States. Despite Trump's threatening comments at the Brussels meeting in July 2018, comments such as Germany being controlled by Russian gas, the meeting still yielded dozens of initiatives to increase defense spending, fight terrorism, deny the threats of cybernetic and hybrid warfare, and to improve the mobility of the armed forces. Unlike the Atlantic Alliance, the SCO have never participated in a military, anti-terrorist, or any real peacekeeping operations. The SCO lacks permanent NATO-style military command structures and formations. If someday a crisis was to happen and needs SCO intervention, they would have to improvise an intervention based on a Sino-Russian-Indian bilateral agreement. The truth is, China and Russia are not very friendly. It is true that they are political allies and a political and diplomatic counterweight to the US, especially in the UN. But in truth, both countries are competing strongly for control and domination of Central Asia, especially with countries such as Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Uzbekistan. China is an economy that increasingly demands more goods, services, energy, and resources. The Asian countries that surround it are lending themselves as suppliers of these services, and this is the current state of Kazakhstan, a country that is rich in oil and natural gas, a country in the Russian-Chinese sphere of influence. Russia fears that China's economic expansion will eventually eclipse the leadership that Russia has on the region. Countries that were formerly Soviet, such as Mongolia, are building more economic, political, and military ties with China. China will become a much more important actor, above all with the implementation of the new Silk Road, which will now strengthen the connection between Europe and China, passing through half of Asia. So in a couple decades, China will eclipse all the economic and military power of all of Asia. Russia will only be a second-class power in the region, and the Russian-Chinese-Indian alliance will surely continue. But now it will be China and India who will take the baton as an economic, military, and political counterweight of the United States on the global scale. China is also the #1 trading partner of the United States. Both countries have a total trade of more than $700 billion. This represents the commercial balance between the two largest countries on the planet. The current SCO is more than anything just a political organization, but at the military level, there is no current coordination such as NATO, which is a formal alliance with protocols, treaties, and agreements. The alliance between China, Russia, and India responds more to an improvisation that isn't entirely organized, but it will be an important geopolitical force in the near future. The US will have its hands tied when it comes to competing with the political, economic, and military influence of the three giants of Asia. In a multipolar world, things are no longer black or white. The US, China, and India are becoming increasingly dependent, and their ties are increasing. Russia is at risk of being displaced by the new Asian giants, which will eventually overshadow Russia entirely. So do you consider the Russian-Chinese-Indian alliance as an effective counterweight against the United States? Or do you think that China and India already overshadow Russia and are indeed potential competitors in the Asia-Europe region? I hope you liked this video, and don't forget to subscribe for new videos every single week. See you next time.